So recapping Seminar 1 very, very briefly, we talked about how it's important to have a definition of innovation. The one that I use commonly, and I've stolen it from Inventium, is change that adds value. It's a very elegant and short definition. Defining it is important for the reason that I've set out there. Effectively, if you can't define it or you can't even agree what it is, very difficult to hit that mark. We talked about the importance of innovation starting and finishing with client needs. That's the most critical piece. If you fall asleep now, which you may well, that's the most critical piece for the innovation message. That is, it is always needs-based and client-centered. It's not a cool idea. If it's a cool idea, as I mentioned last time, we'll be in the business of fidget spinners. Nice ideas, but not particularly commercially viable and helpful to others. One way that we talked about being able to develop your creativity and develop innovation was to question the product service assumptions and then try and marry them up to the needs of the particular end user or the client. And we'll talk a bit about that when we get to the design thinking phase of the presentation as well, which will be the heart of the presentation. And the last bit is to ensure that you do test your ideas and to have a relatively healthy appetite towards risk and failure. We touched on this last time. It's a very difficult thing for lawyers, I think, to talk about failure. Risk we're kind of okay with. People can talk about a healthy degree of risk or whether or not it's a material risk, etc. But failure, we're not so good at talking about. And if you look at some of the most innovative organizations around the world, they talk about failure. In fact, in some weird instances, they celebrate it and the learnings that come out of that. So that's a very quick 2-minute recap of Seminar 1, just to call out some of the themes that are relevant, particularly for this part of the presentation. An important part of developing culture is identifying your key stakeholders and engaging with them appropriately. There are really 3 parts to this, I think. One is, who is my client and user? Sometimes that seems fairly obvious. But in fact, more often than not, when you sit back and reflect on it, it may not be the same person. And sometimes it's not so easy to identify as between who the client and the end user, what needs you need to be satisfied. And sometimes they have conflicting needs. I'll give you an example a bit later on, a real life example that I'll get you guys to help me with about the distinction between client and user and why that's actually very, very significant and shouldn't be overlooked. The second piece is, what resources do you need? I mean, typically, you will need time and people. That's kind of a common denominator across developing innovation, developing creative ideas, getting people to talk amongst themselves. Because as we'll talk about a bit more, setting up an environment for the sharing of those ideas in a safe way is actually critical to making sure that innovation is sustainable. But the other part of it, of course, is finances. I have this running joke where people are more than happy, it's not really a joke, it's actually fairly sad, people are more than happy to talk about innovation, and talk about the fruits of innovation, and they talk about a return on investment, except they're not happy at all to talk about the investment piece. They just want a return without the investment. That can't work. That can't work. There has to be a degree of investment. The question is, what's the most efficient way of going about it? And again, the design thinking process that I'll introduce you to towards the end of this presentation is helpful. And how can we fail quickly if we need to fail? And what are the learnings that come from that? So who is my client and user? What resources do I need? And who do I need to convince? This is probably the most critical out of all of it. And it's the instigator for everything else that kind of falls into place. Who within your organization, who within your teams you need to chat to, what aspects of innovation do you really want to pursue? Are you talking about incremental changes to the way in which you work, to the way in which you deliver services or goods, or are you talking about significant change? In which case, then, you need to be prepared to have this discussion fairly directly and fairly early on in the piece. Let me talk you a little about the innovation culture, just a few points up here. And you'll see these themes in a video that I'm about to show you on Silicon Valley. It's a very interesting video, I think, that articulates why a place like Silicon Valley is so successful. It's not because they have a concentration of innovators there, or they're particularly they're more intelligent than the rest of the world. No, it's because they've developed cultures, programs, structures that actually help them be innovative. And it's a place where innovation is rewarded and it's prioritized. And that's really part of the first part of the pie is actually planning for it. And again, that goes back to the previous slide where we say, who do you need to talk to? Who do you need to engage with? to get on board, to convince you to go on that innovation journey. You have to plan for it. You have to articulate the business case for it, because otherwise you end up not having a structure within which you can operate. And the danger with that is not just a failed structure, but the impacts culturally that has if it doesn't work. Legitimacy is a big thing when it comes to innovation. And legitimacy is reflected in structures. It's reflected in a deliberate approach towards implementing that innovation process, which is why design thinking, again, I keep harping on it, but I will come to it, is actually quite important. Legitimacy is key. And it starts from identifying those individuals that you need to get on board. The second part of it is again, to reward healthy risk-taking and new ideas. That's only part of the equation. I'll show you a quote in a second, but incentivizing folk to think about innovation and to create the space for them to do that, equipping ideas, which is kind of the last point that I'm getting towards, is actually very important. And a big part of that actually is a factor of time. And law firms, as you well know, generally speaking, put a value on time. That's how we interpret, how most of the legal market interprets value by a factor of time. But it's a special challenge in law firms, I think, to equip others in that context and to say, actually, because innovation takes time, because communicating with others takes time, we can pull you away from billable client work to be able to do that. That's a special challenge, I think, for law firms. It's not to say that it's totally unsurmountable. It's not. It's perfectly achievable. But it's one of those things that you need to address, particularly in a law firm context, or in fact, in other commercial environments where you do have a time-based or time-billing system. And the last point I wanted to harp on was learning from failure and sharing ideas. Again, failure is something very difficult for lawyers to talk about, I think, generally speaking. Most of the commercial world, by the way, is getting more and more comfortable talking about failure. If you look at startups in particular, if you look at the Silicon Valley folk that I'll show you the video of in a second, they readily accept failure. The key for them is not so much point, it's extracting all the learnings that come out of that. And so the special challenge for lawyers in particular is embracing to some degree failure because of the byproduct of extracting the learnings. And we don't really look at this piece. We just simply say failure is not an option. And that's a product of the way in which we are trained, and that's a product of the environment in which we operate. Generally speaking, providing relatively high-value services where failure is just not an option. It's an imperative of doing business. And this is the quote that I wanted to come back on when I was talking about incentives. This quote from Stephen Johnson: if you look at history, innovation doesn't come just from giving people incentives. It comes from creating environments where their ideas can connect. And if you look at the previous 4 points, all of those relate to creating that environment. Incentives is a part of it, I think, and it may well translate to KPIs. But all of these lead towards the creation of an environment that actually does fulfill innovation and does enable innovation to happen. I wanted to take you at this point to a video, which will hopefully work, on innovation in Silicon Valley. And I wanted to touch on the learnings from that.
Silicon Valley is 1,500 square miles of the most fertile innovation ground on Earth. To find out what sets this area apart, Strategy and the Bay Area Counsel Economic Institute compared Silicon Valley companies to 1,000 of the world's top innovators. Shockingly, 1 in 5 companies globally have no innovation strategy at all. But in the Bay Area, 90% have a strong strategy supported by top execs. The big question is, why are these companies so far ahead?
We normally say that the Bay Area is successful because it combines innovation capacity, access to capital, and then this secret ingredient called the culture of innovation. But we've never been able to quantify before what that meant.
Almost 50% of Bay Area companies say their corporate culture strongly supports innovation. That's more than double the rest of the world. This culture of innovation is the real secret to Silicon Valley's success.
What makes it different and superior proved to be things around organizational alignment, the culture of putting the customer first, and deep end-user understanding.
And the good news is an innovation culture can be replicated anywhere. First, have a clear innovation strategy, one aligned with your customers' needs. Second, have your technical leads report directly to the CEO. Third, develop and communicate your innovation strategy from the top. And fourth, constantly refresh your product development staff and welcome their ideas. An innovation culture is a real competitive advantage, and it's one you can build anywhere. That's the idea in 90 seconds.
So for those on the web, a particular challenge when you have, for example, a small organization, two people, for innovation. One, I think, just as a very broad comment up front, that's also a great opportunity. So I'm sorry?
Because you're closer.
Because you're closer, because of the point here where communication, you'd hope, between two people is a bit more fluid than a larger organization. But I think in terms of developing creativity amongst those two people, I think, one, it's helpful to see what others in the market are doing, not because you want to be a follower, but because that's a good starting point to adapt. So when we were talking, and I'll digress a little bit here, it's relevant to the later part of the presentation, but it's good to address it now. When I was talking at the last seminar about setting out all the assumptions that are relevant to a particular good or product or service, and then questioning whether or not each of those assumptions, A, is relevant to the end user, or B, is necessary for the end user's experience. That's all predicated on looking what other people have been doing or what's out there in the market, and then adapting and questioning each part of that step. So even though you may not be resource full, if you like, you do have the opportunity to see what other people are doing and to be innovative and to adapt from those particular processes. So effectively taking advantage of the resources that other people have used to come up with those ideas, concepts, goods, services, and then adapting those and saying, well, hang on, in the example that I used last time, were you here last time for the presentation? No. That's probably why you've got a bit of energy in this presentation. But last time, and I'll do this very, very quickly, because I think it's useful to emphasize it again. I gave an example of making tea. Right, fairly basic. And I'm sorry for the people who were here before, but it was an excellent illustration, so I have to do it again. You boil the water, like it's spell. You get a mug. You pour the hot water into the mug. You put the tea bag, and then you have a drink. Right, fairly basic process. So that someone else has already come up with that process. I didn't make that up. Right, everybody has to do it at some point if you're a tea drinker. Unless you have the privilege of somebody else doing it for you. Good luck. But part of that, for example, is questioning why each step is necessary and whether or not it's... So why do I have to use water to begin with? Why couldn't I steam the tea? Why do I have to use a mug? Why couldn't I use a foil container, for example, to drink the tea? Or why couldn't I smoke the tea? Why do I have to drink it? So that does away with the hot water, the mug, and the tea bag. All just a very small illustration to say, even though you may not have resources. They're very simple exercises, which I'll touch on towards the end of the presentation. Very simple exercises that you can pivot off without having umpteen resources to be able to do that. Well, much shuffle along to design thinking. Has anyone heard of design thinking, firstly? Yeah, a few nods. That's fine. I'd like you to do an exercise with me, please. For the next 5 minutes, I'd like you to design a game for me. Just talking amongst yourselves, you don't obviously have any of the tools in front of you, but these are the 3 things that you can use. Let me give you a bit more information. It's not really just a game for me. I'd like a game for my family to be able to play with. I have a young family, 2 daughters, 5 and 2, and a wife. She's much older. And what I'd like you to do is to chat. This is being recorded. Going to end badly. Yeah, you need to edit heavily. Just bleep it. Yeah. What I'd like you to do, please, perhaps with the 2 or 3 people next to you, think of a game that you can design for me using those 3 objects or any one of those 3 objects. I don't really mind. And then we'll come back and share. I'd like you to spend actually 5 minutes on it. I know it sounds like a tedious task, but 5 minutes, please, and then we'll come back. Okay, good. Can I say, I was just mentioning this to Terry while you guys were doing the exercise. So I've done this exercise quite a few times, and I've seen this exercise being done in a room full of innovators, right? So I was in a conference 2 years ago now, and the presenter up the front said, how many people know design thinking? The entire room's hands kind of shot up, right? Everybody knew everything about design thinking. And he said, he didn't quite set this exercise, but a similar exercise. And he came to the same conclusion that I'm about to come to now. All of those ideas are brilliant, really good ideas, creative thinking, using some of the items as a reward, using one of the items as target practice, Meccano set, that kind of idea. But can I encourage you through all of that? No one, and I was available, no one asked what I needed. No one asked any particulars. No one asked who else would be using it. And in that context, by the way, I would have been your most available client. Right here. That's not a rebuke, by the way, of how these things happen. These things happen, as I say, 100% of the time. This is exactly the result that actually happens, is that people are so engaged, and perhaps rightly so, in the creative thinking process and in the opportunity to get to a solution, which, by the way, is the lawyer's natural inclination. They hear a problem, and as they're hearing, much like the way in which I listen to my wife's problems, I'm listening, and then immediately I suggest a solution, usually a bad one, but that's not what she's after in that context. But that's the natural tendency for lawyers. The natural tendency for lawyers, in fact, for most folk, for every folk that this experiment has been done on, is for them to go straight to solution and creativity and engagement with that, but not really go back to what the need is or what the requirements might be or what the timing might be, etc. So what I'm really trying to say is that's a normal part of the process, but it's an important point to kind of draw out when we think about the design thinking process, which I'm about to introduce to you now. And before I do, can I say to you that most folk think about the innovation process as kind of like this, and then you get to an end result. You identify the need, you work through the parameters, and you get to the end result. Fairly discrete, a nice kind of flow to it, etc. Most innovation programs generally look something like this, and it finishes here, right? Because you're constantly testing and you're constantly checking it against the need. We think the need is X, Y, and Z. No, it's actually not. Let's just check that again. How important is that need? How important is that assumption? And you keep going back and forth on a relatively regular basis. It's not to say, by the way, that every innovation process looks like this. But I'm saying to you, get prepared for the innovation process to look like this. This is a lawyer's dream. This is a lawyer's nightmare, right? You mean we have to keep going back and checking, back and checking. Where's my solution? And that's exactly what this exercise is meant to illustrate. We do go naturally to solutions. It's a good thing in the commercial world to be able to say the answer is blah, or the answer is a combination of these things, and the one that I recommend is X. But in a perverse way, when we think about it in the context of innovation, getting to the solution at the beginning actually isn't helpful. Isn't helpful at all. Academics call it a premature innovation cycle. There are probably worse words for it, but that's what they call it. Let me take you through then design thinking. Design thinking emanated, depending on who you ask, in the 50s and 60s. It wanted to adopt, the theory was they wanted to adopt a scientific approach, a regimented approach towards design and the implementation of design and parameters. Its main themes, as you'll see as I walk you through it, are client empathy and deliberate process testing. There's a process to be followed. It may not be the quickest process in the world. It may not be from A to B, quickly, but it does produce good results because each step of the way, you're checking it against client need, and at the appropriate point in time, not at the beginning, at an appropriate point in time, then you begin to suggest solutions and workshop those solutions. So let me take you through these steps. There are essentially 5 to them, and it's not to say, by the way, that is the linear way in which this process will work. Generally speaking, as I say, you may need to keep coming back to things. First is to empathize, second is to define, third is to ideate, 4 is to prototype, and 5 is to test. And as I say, please don't think of it like this, think of it like this, because it'll help your sanity once you start going through the process. Step 1, excuse me, is starting with the need. Who is my client and what are my client's needs? In the example that I gave you, in the practical example that I gave you, I was your client, but really the end users were myself, the kids, my wife, etc. So when I use client here, I mean it more generically. What are the client/end users' needs that I'm trying to address as part of this innovation? Every good innovation starts with a need. It doesn't start with a cool idea. If it starts with a cool idea, it'll fizzle fairly quickly, chances are. And you can see there, for example, a fairly facetious diagram that actually works through some of the needs and some of the flowcharts for getting a taxi versus getting an Uber. But how do you start with this step of empathizing with the client, the end user, etc.? One, you can ask them. Fairly obvious place to start. Lawyers seem to be embarrassed about asking. I don't know if it makes them think that they're silly or stupid or they don't have full command of the knowledge, but it's the perfect place to start. And there's no quicker way, by the way, to make a client feel valued than to ask them. Ask them. So don't be shy about doing that. Two, observe clients sounds kind of creepy, right? Follow them wherever they go. Breathe heavily, on the necks as they think about at least their client experience. That's what we really mean by these 2 points. Observe the clients, map out the client engagement with your service. So then you can begin to articulate where some of these needs actually sit. What is the need? What is the need? What is the need? And have a look at what your competition is doing. It kind of touches a little bit on the question that was asked before. What are other people doing to address needs? And what needs are being met by the competition versus what I'm doing? Does that kind of make sense? I might pause there if there's any comments or questions. There's only 5 steps to it, and believe me, we'll whiz through them fairly quickly. So if you have any comments or questions on this, I'm happy to take them as we go. So one is empathize. Who is the client and what are the client's needs? And then once you've gotten a substantive list of it, try and isolate then what needs or frustrations are you trying to solve for, and be specific. And come to a question and statement. I am solving for this particular need, and then articulate enough what is in scope and what is out of scope. So, for example, in my case, let me give you, so if I was to take you a step back, my needs are to entertain the children, keep them happy, keep them entertained, keep them safe, even though it wasn't an express requirement of mine. And then what frustrations are you trying to solve for them? Kids never pay attention. The kids get distracted relatively easily. The kids hurt each other, usually, then they usually hurt the parents. What's in and out of scope? I don't want any digital games, for example. They've got enough TV time or iPad time or what have you. It has to be something relatively interactive. It has to be something that engages the age ranges of the people involved. Do you see where I'm going with this, with that example and fleshing it out? Please, as I mentioned to you up front, don't try and solve. This is not the stage to solve. This is the stage to begin to articulate what the need is that you're actually pursuing. And solving it too early means that you actually might miss out on getting a product or a service that is just right for that need, because you've cut the steps too short. So don't try and solve it at this stage. And then try and rank the frustrations in order of significance, so you can then begin to target them a bit more efficiently. Again, we're talking about return on investment. This is not a scattergun approach. This is not any size fits all, any idea fits all, whatever. It has to be actually based on some rational thinking, some deliberate thought that sits behind all of that, so that you can make sure that you're actually going through the steps, hopefully. You can see there, if ever you wanted an example of a genius telling you to slow down, to go fast, this is probably the best one. If I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes defining it and 5 minutes solving it. We do the opposite. We do the opposite. That's the natural tendency for folk. And if you wanted an example, I gave you an example before. So there. So step 3 is to then ideate. Again, this is not the solution stage. The natural thinking of many of you in the room will be, well, yeah, but can we get on with it? When does the solution come? This is about brainstorming potential solutions. Any idea and every idea is a good idea at this stage. We're not here to be rational. And we're not here to be cutting down ideas based on resources or on time or on cost. This is genuinely thinking out loud, vomiting whatever comes into your mouth, into your brain, and beginning to spur a discussion. And actually, as part of the communication piece, leveraging off that, so not just hearing people out, but engaging with what they're saying in an effective way is a critical part of this process. And for lawyers, and this is hard and ironic given a person like me is giving the presentation, but it's helpful for you to be quiet when those ideas are being proposed, right? I don't mean that in any paternal way, but the reality is very simple. Generally speaking, when you hear something that sounds like rubbish, you want to shut it down fairly quickly, which is why I'm surprised none of you have gotten up as yet. But the point of this particular step is to stop and actually just brainstorm ideas. Plot those ideas out and work through it. Don't be critical of other ideas. That's not the point of this particular exercise. And again, try and pivot off other people's ideas. Don't just let them float under the ether and you're just concerned about your idea and you think your idea is the best idea. Believe me, we've all been there. We've done that and we bought the T-shirt, right? Everybody thinks that their idea is the best idea. Generally speaking, they're not suggesting it because they think it's crap. But try and put that all to one side and suggest ideas to those that are being actually proposed. And don't be hamstrung with your particular idea. So in my case, for example, if we're going to ideate for my case, we've got limited resources, but I'm going to ignore that for a second. So we could do, for example, an activity outside. Why does it have to be inside? It could be by the beach where the kids can play. It could be in a pool, presuming none of them drown. It could be a game on paper. It could be a game with blocks. You'd end up with a number of permutations before you drill down to and say, and this will come later, what resources do I actually have and what can we actually implement? Or what combination of ideas can we actually implement? So that's step 3 on ideate. Any questions? Excuse me. No? Step 4, now you start settling on a solution. And the important part of this is to begin to be able to test it. It's not enough just to come up with a solution and say, that's it, we're going to roll it out, and everybody's going to be happy with the end result. It's generally speaking, prototyping it in a very cost-efficient way. For those of you that weren't here last time, we talked about the idea of a minimum viable product, the absolute minimum to test your idea. That saves on cost, and that controls the degree of failure. It doesn't eliminate failure. That's not what we're after. What we're after is really safe failure and quick failure. If our idea is not going to work, we want to know fairly quickly, and we want to know the cheapest cost and time and resources applied to that. You could do a mock-up of it, of the game. You could do a manual for the game. You could do an instruction sheet. You could plan out the different steps of the game. Again, all of those pretty cost efficient, pretty quick. But they'll get you a fairly quick answer on has this got some legs or hasn't it? And if it does have some legs, how can we pivot it to make it even better? And that's an important part of the process. One of the challenges when you get to this stage in particular is that because you've worked through the process, and at points it's eye-watering, we're now up to step 4, you are now wedded to your idea. Right? You're getting there and you're thinking, this is God's gift to the legal profession. Right? This is the absolute best idea ever. And the reality is when you begin to test, sometimes that's not the answer you get. Right? And you've got to be prepared to live with that. I'll come to that in a second. But some of the tips for this stage: do a mock-up, chat to the folk. That's a really good idea. Be clear on the needs that you are solving for. And that's critical. It's critical that you monitor that throughout the whole cycle. Because as I say, true innovation, disruptive innovation, sustainable innovation is rooted not on a cool idea, but it is rooted on a need. And if you're not clear on the need, be prepared for it to fail. It takes up a lot of time, takes a lot of resources to produce a cool idea that nobody actually wants to use because there is no need for it. When we think about then testing, the key is who should you approach to test your particular solution? That's the number one question, right? You can read the rest of it, but the number one determinant, I think, of your success is talking to the right people and testing it with the right people. They've got to be careful in that context, obviously, because your idea is not fully formed necessarily. Your idea may be replicated by somebody else, particularly if you're talking in a highly competitive market or in a market that's fairly incestuous, of which there are a few. Who you should approach to test the solution is just as critical as the solution itself. And ask them open-ended questions. It's not a question of just yes and no. Would you use this? Yes. Oh, particularly helpful, illuminating. How much would you pay for this? Who would use this in your organization? What particular aspects of the software, good, whatever it is, service, appeal to you most? Because then what you're trying to do is test, one, does it meet the need, and the degree to which it meets the need. There's no point asking closed questions at this stage, but again, as I mentioned a few slides ago, the key is actually going out there and talking to folk who have an interest, who may use the product, who may supply goods and services as part of your overall package. But ask open-ended question and try it yourself. one of the things that we often fail to do is actually take that step back and say, well, if I was to use this, what would some of the niggles that I would have be? If I was to adapt it for my particular workplace or my environment, what would it look like? How would it work in practice, etc.? So try it yourself. A couple of tips there. Cast the net as wide as possible. Now, the challenge at this stage of the process is that, particularly if you want to talk to people, people may not always want to be talking to you. They may not have a particular incentive behind it. They may not have a particular need. They may not have the time or the resources to talk to you about it. So the key, as part of casting the net as wide as possible and talking to the right people, is thinking about what's in it for them. And it may well be that if the product or the good or the service takes off, they may get a benefit from it. You may give them a discounted arrangement, etc. But what is in it for them is an important point to actually getting your product properly tested or service properly tested and making sure that it's actually valid. And journal your interactions and share those amongst your particular team, however large, 2, 3, I was going to say 1, you can't really quite do it with 1, but journal those interactions and share those learnings as amongst each other, because that's a really key part of developing those ideas and pivoting if you need to. As I say, the process will look a little bit more like this than like this. Just be prepared for that. And to the extent that some of your testing produces results that you're not happy with, have a reality check. Have a reality check. Forging through with an idea which has been tested and been found to be invalid, or you haven't fully tested it, is just as bad as starting off with a great idea and saying that's what we're going to implement, blind of any needs or blind of any assumptions. Does that make sense? Good. So let me give you some tips more generally in relation to design thinking, just to help you think about this process. Don't assume anything. Test it. Again, lawyers have a real struggle with this sometimes because we like to know everything and we think we know everything. Most of the time we do. But don't assume anything. Test it as a kind of a first principle. 2, don't be wedded to the idea, be wedded to the problem. What's the problem that you're solving? What's the need that you're meeting? Be wedded to that. Pivot off that. But don't be wedded to your idea. However late you think in the process you've come as part of the innovation cycle. And 3, follow the steps. Follow the steps. The natural temptation is to get the solution quickly. And the reality is pretty simple. That if you get the solution quickly, you may not actually have a good solution. You may not have a solution that meets a need. You may not have a solution that is viable. And you may not have a solution that anybody actually wants to use or deploy.